I'm Susan Cauley, and welcome to You're Not Alone, Surviving Your Child's Disability. Being bullied makes a child feel helpless and isolated, especially a child with a disability. Here to discuss bullying, its effects, signs, and risks are Catherine Mays, Autism Project Advocate for Massachusetts Advocates for Children, and Valerie McIver, Young Adult Fellow, and also at the Massachusetts Advocates for Children. Hi, welcome.
Hi.
Hello.
Nice
How
to
are
see
you?
Hi.
Good. The first question is, what are some warning signs that your child with a disability is being bullied?
Well, that's a really good question, Susan, and it's different for every child.
Mm-hmm.
So any kind of anxiety about going to school would be an indication. Suddenly, if your child does not want to get on the bus would be a good indication.
Mm-hmm.
Even a child that does not speak, has no language, their behavior can tell you that they're worried about something occurring.
Mm-hmm.
So watching for changes in behavior would be really critical.
Okay.
And that can be on particular days, because if Tuesday is gym day,
And
your
somebody
child
at the
exactly,
gym.
and your child starts showing some anxiety, that would be a good sign. Also, to notice if things start being missing, backpacks or personal belongings.
That's an interesting thing to think about. I never thought of that, the bully taking things.
Exactly, and I know that happens, that backpacks get dumped, clothing gets torn sometimes, but it's not the obvious indicators that we would imagine, like bruising or a child coming home and having tears on their faces. It can be a lot of nonverbal communication,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what parents should watch out for, particularly with nonverbal children.
Okay.
With verbal kids, I think listening really hard. If you notice that your child is suddenly not talking about the lunchroom when they were happily talking about the lunchroom, that would be another indicator.
Right.
And Val, I don't know, what in your experience, did you come home sharing immediately if things were not right at school?
When I was bullied, I knew that there was something wrong with my experience at school.
Mm-hmm.
But it took me a while to realize what specifically was throwing me off about school. So I would just come home, and even though I was in a safer space, I'd say, I just react really negatively, or too big of a reaction for any situation that wouldn't normally throw me off. And my parents would say, "Is something bothering you?" And I'd say, "I don't know," or "No," or
Mm-hmm.
something that didn't really help the situation because I might not even know.
Right.
So a student that I worked with, that I was the advocate for, was crying at night and became fearful of being left alone in her room.
Wow.
And so her parents noted that,
Mm-hmm.
and that was the first indication that they had. So
Wow.
even if you're as articulate as Val,
Right.
you may not know how to describe what's happening.
Well, my daughter is the same way. She doesn't know how to describe things, and sometimes she just says, if you ask her what's wrong, she'll say, "I'm good," or
Right.
something like that, and so it's very difficult to
Right.
tell what's going on with her. What are the psychological and behavioral risks for a child with a disability who's being bullied?
Oh, they're huge. I work in the higher end of the autism spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
mostly, and I see kids who are refusing to go to school at all. I see kids who are not able to access the curriculum in school. I see kids who experience real trauma by being bullied, and they're needing cognitive behavioral therapy to help them to get past it.
Wow.
And they're also needing to be taught what is bullying and how to respond to it. And I know, again, Val, you've had the experience of being bullied. And what was the long-term impact on you?
I think the long-term effect has more to do with just not trusting your gut anymore. You think, well, if everybody's saying to me that I'm X, Y, and Z, and those are all negative X, Y, and Z's, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
then you think, well, I must be those things because you're younger and you just don't know any
Right.
better or any
Right.
different. And then when I got older, it was the same thing. I started not trusting that I could be a good person anymore, because I thought that since they didn't think so, they must be better than me, and so on.
Right.
Can you clarify then what exactly is bullying?
Yes. Under the law, bullying is repeated incidents which make a student feel unsafe at school, which make them unable to access the curriculum, which make them feel threatened. And bullying can be verbal, it can be cyberbullying, electronic media, it can be in written material, it can be nonverbal assaults, to use that word. And assault can be everything from actual physical harm to people repeatedly doing things which they know will get a rise out of the disabled person. So in one school that I was working with a client, students had figured out if they all dropped their pencils or if they bumped into the child, they would eventually get a rise out of him. And that's what they were after, was the rise.
Yep.
And it was very, very complicated for that child. And the kids knew, and they would still go after it.
Wow.
My son's own case, it was staff at the school that he was at who bullied him. And
You're kidding.
No, I wish I was, but I'm not. And they frequently use the R word to address him until it became clear to us, and we put a stop to it.
Wow.
But even, there was this big question about, well, was my son telling the truth? Did he understand what was being said to him? And fortunately, his neuropsychologist was at the meeting, and he was able to explain that my son did not tell lies because he was an autistic person.
Right.
And autistic people don't know necessarily how to lie.
Right.
And secondly, he was not cognitively impaired, which was not the word that they were using, but it's the word I'm using, and that he was really able to tell when someone was being mean to him and using that word that we all hate that begins with an R.
Is teasing part of bullying, or is that something separate?
I think it's actually the same. It's a matter of how much it gets escalated. And for a person on the autism spectrum who doesn't necessarily understand social pragmatics or understand what people are saying to them, to be teased can feel like bullying.
Right.
And if it feels like bullying and you feel like you're being intruded on, you still need to be taught how to navigate that.
Right.
And that's not what happened to you initially, right? Nobody taught you initially how to handle it.
I wish I had had the experience of there being a bullying curriculum when I was younger, but there just wasn't.
Yeah. Is there now?
Well, now that I've graduated from high school, I've learned a lot about bullying through just doing the various things that I do with Massachusetts Advocates for Children.
Yeah.
But as far as experiencing, I'll do a lot of reflecting, because that's how I learning from my past.
But to answer your question, in 2010, in Massachusetts, all schools were obliged to develop an anti-bullying curriculum for all students. And also to use the process of team meetings and IEPs to remediate any kind of bullying, and to give skills and to help students to understand how to be safe.
Right. Do you believe that children with disabilities are more inclined to suffer from extreme depression and anxiety, and also have some suicidal tendencies?
Do you want to answer that?
I think you should go first, and then I'd be happy to answer that.
It's been in my casework, that's exactly what I've seen. I've seen, I worked for a student in Boston, and he was repeatedly bullied, and then he wanted to injure himself. Not everybody does that,
right.
But it does happen. But it damages kids with disabilities, I think, in a different way, because they don't have the natural supports that typical kids have.
Right.
Because they're less likely to have a full range of friends, full range of people with whom they're intimate and who are going to watch their backs.
It's mostly staff.
And it's mostly staff that they interact with.
Right.
So one of the parts of the bullying law that I think is really interesting is to make sure that the IEP team looks for an opportunity within the school to have a student participate in an activity as a leader, potentially, or as someone who has a strength in that area. So for my son, his strength was in sports. And so being part of a track team meant that there were people who had another context for him other than just be sitting next to him. And so he developed some relationships that way. He also played football, which was not as good a choice.
Right.
And that's where a lot of bullying occurred, was with football. But generally, to give a child an opportunity to have people see them as somebody who is able, whatever that means. It could be chess club, it could be through the friendship club, it could be in the band, it could be if you have a good skill with math, it could be if you have a good skill with cooking, or even a good skill with recognizing people and knowing who they are and recognizing their faces.
Val, did you have some kind of hobby or something that you had in school? Like, did you have an opportunity to be in like art or whatever is offered?
I really enjoyed participating in choir. Chorus was one of the first things that I did when I branched out from the smaller program I was in into the larger setting of the high school. It gave me confidence because I knew I loved to sing. I didn't have to question how to do it. It just kind of came naturally.
Right.
And then I would branch out into academics later on, trying things like Spanish, because I always have loved Spanish ever since I started learning it in middle school. And then English, I always loved to write, so it was okay for me. I didn't consider academics a place where I had to worry about making mistakes. So if I made mistakes in the social realms, I figured I could make up for that by doing my best in the academics.
Oh, okay. If a child with special needs is not aware of being bullied, but you know that your child is being bullied, what can parents do to handle the situation?
The most important thing is to create a paper trail of your concerns as a parent or your concerns as a student. I worked in a particular with a particular family where their child was being bullied on the bus and didn't really understand it, but the parent kept track by sending an email into the school every day. They weren't confrontational emails, but they were, you know, she has come home today and she's crying and she's clearly anxious about something, or she's saying that this girl is mean to her. And we talk about it as a case study at MAC. And to resolve the bullying took 3 team meetings and 2 mediations. But when we walked into the first mediation and there was a pile of paper this thick about incidents that had happened, it was so powerful.
Wow.
Now, I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think parents should trust their instinct that something is happening, something is wrong, because any student is going to be more comfortable at home with telling or indicating that something's going on, whether they tell you verbally or they tell you behaviorally. So I think parents should pay attention and document. And if you think something is like that is happening within the bullying law, you are encouraged to call a team meeting immediately.
Right.
And bring the team together and tell your concerns and try to work out a solution.
Now, do classroom aides and teachers have the responsibility of reporting any bullying that they see?
Absolutely. They are obliged to report it. But often they don't see it. Often it can be subtle, and it can be behind someone's back. And where it happens, typically, is in unstructured times. It happens in the cafeteria. It happens on the bus.
Right.
It happens in the bus line. It happens in the hallways of the school. So most often, the bullies are careful not to show people what they're doing.
Right, kind of in back of the teachers
Exactly.
or the aides, and kind of like doing it when nobody's around.
Right. And so what happens as a result is our children with disabilities will respond and not realize that they need to conceal what they're doing, because that's not part of how they think. They don't necessarily understand that. And so the reaction of that child that I told you about in the beginning was to explode and act out. And then initially he was punished for actually being aggressive when what he was doing was responding to how he was being provoked. And your situation was similar, wasn't it?
Yeah, I would start melting down, and people would be like, there's no reason to melt down here. I'd be like, there is, but I didn't know how to explain what the reason was. Sometimes I wouldn't know exactly what had happened, and I just knew it made me upset. So that wasn't very helpful. And I think that sometimes people assume that monitoring the behaviors of the child by having somebody watch them as much as possible will solve things. I think the reality is you can't monitor someone 100% of the time.
Right.
And even if you did, it doesn't necessarily keep them safe 100% of the time. Because that's just the way it is. And so I think that one thing that really helped me is, as someone with autism but who also is able to speak, I have had the fortunate experience of discovering that I love role playing. And so if I don't know how to do a situation in real life, at least I can practice beforehand.
Right. Now, why doesn't a child with a disability ask for help? Would you address that, Valerie?
Yeah, sure. So I think part of it is just unawareness that they need help. I know that when I was bullied, I thought, oh, I can figure this out. I don't know what I'm doing, but there's got to be a way around this. It can't. And at first, I was very positive with myself, thinking like, I can make them be my friends somehow. If I give them enough things from my lunch, or if I'm friendly enough, things will go away.
Or you laugh at
their jokes, or try to
their
dress like them, or anything like that. It didn't really do it didn't fix the problem though. So eventually, I just remember one time I walked into my therapist's office and said, look, this is a problem, but I can't really describe to you what the problem is. I just know I have a problem. And I know it's with this student, but I don't know any more details than that.
Right.
So I think the other thing is, to Val's point, that they may not have the language to explain it.
Right.
They may not understand that they're being bullied.
Right.
So they're not going to ask for help. But I think that to have somebody observe them, like a functional behavioral assessment, in a really unstructured time to see how they interact with other people would be a really good place to start, to see where bullying might occur.
I was so worried about retaliation. I was just so worried that somebody would react to me, because I was told, don't tell so-and-so that this happened to you. And so then I thought, I better not, because I'm a rule follower.
Right.
So
in the case of an older student, 18-year-old, one of the things that we did at her IEP meeting, because I had heard this from Val, you're being told not to say anything. And so what we did is have her role play. What do you do if somebody says, don't say anything?
Right.
And I thought that was really, really
it's an excellent
useful
way of doing it. Yeah, I mean, role playing gives them an opportunity to, understand what's going on. To switch gears a little bit, what type of child or adult would bully children with special needs?
I think that the hardest part about understanding special education students is that we all are different. And so people get it in their heads that they know what a special education student is like, and that they know that that they're vulnerable. That becomes obvious quite quickly.
Right.
And if a student that it does not have a disability walks up to a student that has a disability, they know that they have the advantage right there, and that is power right there.
Yeah.
So it's someone who needs to feel powerful. You know, and it also, you know, it can be someone who has experienced bullying themselves, and that's how they interact in the world. They're mean kids. They're just mean kids because maybe people have treated them meanly. And I know with my own son, I got to a point where I got tired of saying, well, you know, that child, this is going on in their home, and they, you know, they've had a difficult time. And I really got tired of saying that because my own son had a difficult time because he was a person with autism. Valerie is a person with autism, and things are difficult for her. So why are we giving somebody more forgiveness or more room to behave badly? And I think it's really... bullies are bullying everyone, although students with disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely to be bullied and to be bullied for longer periods of time.
Because the child or the person that's being bullied doesn't quite understand, and it takes a while for them to catch on. Yeah.
There's this challenge with awareness, this big theme that people think that they know who a special education student is, and that obviously, since the special education student is acting differently than them, that the majority, since they don't act special education, the typical peers, they think, oh, that person stands out in a bad way, so they're less smart, they're less able. And sometimes, in some ways, I am less able. I have a disability, but I am doing my best every day just like everyone else, and I will continue to do that.
That's great.
So to get back to your question about what should parents do after they convene an IEP meeting, is there are places within the IEP, within this, you know, the social goals with the speech language pathologist, within counseling goals, within even within their academic goals, for them to be taught what bullying is and how to respond and how to advocate for themselves. And I think another thing that's really critical is creating a pass to a safe person. And I think the student needs to tell us who that safe person is, or to indicate who that safe person is. And it could be a guidance counselor, it could be a speech language pathologist, it could be the principal, but there has to be someone who understands, they can confide in, and who understands the disability.
Right. Now, speaking of IEP or ISP, because adults, children, get abused and they get bullied as well. What can the ISP or the IEP put in place to keep the bullying to a minimum?
So within the IEPs now, because of the law, if you're a student who is vulnerable to being bullied because you have social pragmatic difficulties, if you're on the autism spectrum, it's understood that you absolutely need to raise this issue about your vulnerability to bullying at the IEP team meeting. But all students with disabilities, that question should be asked. Is this student vulnerable to bullying, and how? And then within the IEP, find places to make it clear that the student is vulnerable and what it is that they need, and benchmarks within goals to help them gain skills.
Okay. Why does bullying behavior, or when does bullying behavior cross the line into disability harassment?
That's when language is used, or someone uses body language to mock the person based on their disability. So a very simple example would be someone following another student who walks with difficulty and mimics that walk. I think personally, people who manipulate persons on the autism spectrum because of their social pragmatic difficulties, I think that you could say that it's both disability harassment and bullying. But there is a letter on the Office of Civil Rights, because that's when you are talking about harassment based on disability, is with the Office of Civil Rights, because there are laws that are in particular to address that issue. And on the Office of Civil Rights website, there is a Dear Colleague letter that is October. And within that letter, there's an extensive description of what harassment based on disability is and what you can do if that happens.
Right. Just quickly, how does cyberbullying affect a child with a disability?
Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I think it's pretty frequent that this can happen. In this day and age, I think a lot of people, both disabled and non-disabled, will log into somewhere like Facebook and say something along the lines of anything that they shouldn't say in real life. But because it's one step removed, you don't have to look at the person's reaction, you don't have to hear their response, it just seems safer to do so. So I just think it's really dangerous. I really do.
And it's happening with greater frequency. And
right. Do you think it's something that they can spread the word faster, or something like that, when they're on their computer or their phone or whatever, that it's, the bullying kind of spreads?
Well, I think it's what Val said. I think that it is a way in which people communicate now, and without having someone directly there, people feel freer to say whatever they want to say.
People forget that there's a witness.
Right. And interestingly, all of that can be found. So if somebody is doing that, in particular to a student with a disability,
right, then they can find it easier.
You can find that, and that's evidence, and that's really important. I also think that it is much more prevalent. We get calls frequently at MAC about students who are being cyberbullied, and it's horrific. And the impact on the people who are being targeted is they become fearful because they understand it's a whole school community.
Right. Now, just quickly, what are some tips for parents to avoid or stop bullying from happening?
I think the first thing is to trust your instinct. If your child's behavior is changing, reach out to the school, to whomever it is in the school that is your team chair. Convene meetings. I think it's important to talk to other parents, because often you find out that bullying is going on from other people's children through their parents.
Right.
I think to role play at home, how to interact with someone, and if somebody says something like that to you, what can you respond? How can you respond? And I think finding ways for students to be seen as having social credentials or social credibility in some way in the school, like Val with chorus,
right,
is hugely important.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate it. And parents of children with disabilities can prevent or stop bullying by becoming aware and observant of your child's learning environment and extracurricular activities. See you next time on You're Not Alone, Surviving Your Child's Disability.